So One Piece chapter 1098 just dropped and we got more information about Bonnie's true age and the circumstances surrounding her birth. And Oda went about as dark as he ever really has with this one, and I don't think any of us, including Oda ironically, were really prepared for this since he barely got the chapter done in time this week, and that's why some of the pages still look like sketches. And really, I'm glad Oda's getting a well-deserved break because we actually know from an interview in 2015 that Oda was also late turning in his manuscript for the chapter where Rebecca met Kiros, and that chapter is pretty similar to 1098 because it's yet another story about a very good dad and his daughter. And I know that this is also the first time Oda's had 3 chapters in a row for a while, so that could also be the reason for this, but I like to just think that Oda's a sucker for these good dad stories. He has 2 daughters of his own, so it does kind of make sense. But before we dive into the chapter, I do want to ask that y'all make sure to subscribe to the channel. We're going to be doing reviews over here for every chapter for the rest of the series, so why not help your boy out? But as for the chapter itself, who would have guessed that Bonnie would actually be the result of an unconsensual relationship between Guinea and a celestial dragon? Like, by any type of standard, fictional or not, that's pretty dark, and for One Piece, that's exceptionally dark. And we also learned that Bonnie is actually just 12 years old instead of the 24 that Oda told us. And I saw this insane tweet from Pewpiece that Droog sent in the Discord, and I had to mention it right away because during Bonnie's first introduction in the story, not only did she look about 10 years old, which she would have been back then in Sabaody, she also stopped Zoro from interfering with Sharlos getting a new wife. This is essentially the same thing that her mom went through. Oda's foreshadowing is absolutely insane for this, like even compared to his normal standards, like legitimate galaxy brain material. And now she may not have known about her mom at this point because we know she didn't get Kuma's memories till just recently, and I mean, who's gonna tell a 10-year-old girl the truth about what happened? So that just makes everything a little bit crazier, I think. But going back to the chapter, you can't help but feel for this man Kuma at this point. I mean, not only was he a slave as a child to those celestial dragons, but now his girlfriend or wife or whatever was forced to become one of their wives. And they even had a child with her. And due to some disease, which we're definitely going to talk about more in a minute, she became sick and died trying to escape with her child. I mean, this is legitimately rivaling every other flashback in the story for the saddest one right now, and probably winning, honestly. Especially when you see Kuma being the great dad that he is over the years, and battling with the Revolutionary Army in between. It just shows the insane depth to his character. By day, he's taking care of his daughter, by night, he's saving different countries from being controlled by the government. This dude's been through so much, but he's still doing everything the right way and helping people. And now we still have to learn about how Vegapunk gets involved and how Kuma becomes a cyborg, and I think in all likelihood that will be the cost he had to bear to save Bonnie from the disease. Because the last time we see them at the end of the chapter, it was about 7 years ago, and Vegapunk started working for the government over 20 years ago. So at this point, any help Kuma would get Bonnie's probably going to come at a major cost if Vegapunk's involved, and that might be why he became a robot at Saturn's behest. I feel like I could talk for hours about Kuma's character at this point, but he's just going to get a full character analysis video on the main channel once Egghead's over, so I want to move into some other elements of the chapter, like for example that Sapphire Scale disease that both Guinea and Bonnie have had, because I think I'm onto something big here. Because when I first heard it, I immediately thought back to Kaido, who is a dragon with blue scales, since, you know, sapphires are blue, and Luffy even mentioned while training with Hyogoro how tough those scales were. But obviously Kaido's weren't sapphire, right? However, then I thought back to God Valley and Hachinosu, where the government took something called the Crown Jewel of Hachinosu. And while it isn't confirmed, of course, I and several others were already thinking that it had to be Kaido's fruit because it was the first thing that Big Mom went for. I mean, her and Kaido's little back and forth even hints that she was talking about a devil fruit, and then we see her grab it right away, right? So I think that makes sense. And then in this chapter, we see Kuma call Bonnie's sapphires jewels, which led to her name now, which is Jewelry Bonnie. So could Kaido's fruit, or maybe the Azure Dragon itself or something, have something to do with this disease? Now on the surface, that might seem a little odd, but I thought ZMP323 put it pretty well, where it seems like there are implications for this fruit far beyond its strength. Now Vegapunk tried duplicating Kaido's fruit, and the government was even well aware of that. I mean, Vegapunk did it in their lab, and they intended to seize the fruit when it was done if it was a success. And Guernica from CP0 even talked about how glad he was that that duplicate was a failure. So I think it's fair to say at this point that the government has a very vested interest in Kaido's fruit, and maybe that even extends into this disease somehow and everything at God Valley. So I see two kinds of ways for this to go down. One is that it has something to do with Celestial Dragon DNA, and I'll talk about that one second, because the one I want to talk about right now is the idea that maybe Vegapunk actually created this Sapphire Scale disease in yet another attempt to duplicate Kaido's powers. Now this is something we kinda saw with Queen during Onigashima with the Ice Oni virus, something that he even called his magnum opus. People who got infected with that virus were able to literally transform into an Ice Oni, but eventually would succumb to it, rampage, and presumably die. And we know that Vegapunk worked with Queen on Mads all those years ago before breaking off to work solo for the government. And we also know that Vegapunk failed at duplicating Kaido's fruit because of the color. And he still hasn't confirmed whether the awakening works either, which Kaido didn't awaken his in Wano either somehow, so maybe Oda's hiding that for a reason. Maybe Kaido's awakening lets him become a Sapphire Dragon or something. And perhaps this disease that Ginny suffered from is the result of Vegapunk testing a new way to duplicate Kaido's powers. However, obviously this one also failed, in a much worse way than the fruit did because it gives people this horrible disease. I mean, Vegapunk has already repeated a lot of what the Mads crew has also done, right? I mean, the Seraphim are kind of his version of Judge's kids, he duplicated a zone like Caesar did, although with much better methods, and now maybe that disease aspect with Queen is going to come back into play with the Sapphire Scale disease. But I do want to address a few fair bits of criticism for this, with the first one kind of being the logistics of it, like how Ginny was supposed to be one of the Celestial Dragon's wives, so why would she get used as a test subject for this? But as we saw with Sharlos, they do get rid of their old wives pretty regularly, so I can definitely see a scenario where like once she was no longer needed as a wife, they kind of repurposed her for these experiments, which is super twisted when you think about it, but at this point Oda's not really holding back anymore. And then she, and likely others, would have been sent out into the world to just die from that disease. That could be why the doctor told Kuma, these days you rarely see it. Maybe it popped up just once a few years ago, but then vanished suddenly because they all died like Ginny did, and now Bonnie is kind of a super rare new case basically. Because if it was something that was ever super common at any point, the other doctors would have known about it, or at least would have found it in a book or something, I would imagine. I mean, how many diseases can there be in the world where you get sapphires on your skin, right? If it was common, I feel like they would have been recorded somewhere. So I think this doctor here maybe saw other people who had it around the time that Ginny escaped a few years ago, but then it disappeared, and now a few years later he's seeing it again with Bonnie, and that leads to this kind of dialogue. And then I think another fair piece of criticism here is that it does kind of make Vegapunk look a little more inhumane than Oda paints him out to be sometimes. And while I can definitely see that, Vegapunk is also not really that innocent either. I mean, on Punk Hazard, we saw King screaming in a pit of fire until Kaido saved him, and King was really young at that point too. So if Vegapunk had to work on this disease for the government, I think he would be reluctant, but he would probably just do it in the safest way possible. Like at least by making it not contagious, which does seem to be the case here since nobody else got it except for Bonnie, since she's literally the daughter of a woman who had it. But if it isn't this Vegapunk virus idea, then let's talk about the second option, which to me is almost just as good, and that's that the Celestial Dragon's lineage factor causes this somehow. Because whether we like to think about it or not, which we definitely don't like to think about it, there was and or is Celestial Dragon lineage factor within both Ginny and Bonnie. But they're humans obviously, so maybe the mixing of the two is what led to this. And remember, the disease is still creating Sapphire Scales, so even if the whole virus part of the last theory I said isn't correct, a lot of the Kaido stuff is probably still pretty valid, I think. So maybe these Sapphire Scales are a hint to the true nature of the Celestial Dragons. Maybe the name Celestial Dragons is more literal than we think. Now, of course, Sharlos himself looks like a total doofus, but there may be a reason that he and other Celestial Dragons seem to be inbred. Not only does the scale aspect tie to the dragon part of their Celestial Dragon name, but even the celestial part is kind of represented in the fact that these sapphires grow when shown to sunlight or moonlight. So this leads me to a very important question. Which Celestial Dragon is Bonnie's biological dad? Now, I shudder to think of this possibility, but as Brandon King so kindly mentioned during my stream, could the dad be Saturn? Could Saint J. Garcia bum-ass Saturn have taken Kuma's girl as a slave wife and then basically caused her death as well? I mean, think about how awful that would be for literally everyone involved. Now, this could add to the reason why Saturn said they could leave Bonnie alone, and why he let her stab him. And like Brandon King said, the biological biological dad could be like Satan, especially after seeing him crawl out of the summoning circle, but the one that Bonnie would call dad, her real dad, would be more like Jesus, kind of the opposite of that, which that parallel should be pretty obvious now with Kuma being a priest, holding a Bible all the time, and even talking about sun god Nika. Now, the issue I have with this is that you would imagine that a Gorosei's child, whether they're a half commoner or not, wouldn't be allowed to live out in the world freely. But I mean, who knows? They do a lot of weird stuff all the time, so I don't know. I do think it's a little more likely though that it was just some regular celestial dragon, one that Oda may not even share with us honestly, but it being Saturn would be pretty insane. So as if the heartstrings weren't being pulled on enough for Kuma, I think we also need to talk about what transpired at the very end of the chapter, where King Bikori has yet again returned after 16 years to reclaim his land. And the narrator even said a familiar nightmare would soon descend on the kingdom of Sorbet, only 1 year later. And I think the familiarity part here is probably to God Valley, meaning Kuma's gonna witness something similar to what happened back then, except this time in Sorbet. And we know Bikori was a celestial dragon puppet, so that all kinda does make sense. And we also know that they do cleansings like at God Valley every 3 years, and God Valley was 38 years ago. But this event takes place about 6 years ago, meaning they are 32 years apart, and since 32 isn't divisible by 3, this must be some kind of random attack that is just similar to God Valley as opposed to an official cleansing. And I think it's fair to say it's also similar to Dressrosa. Even the fact they said it's like 16 years ago ties to Doflamingo because his final attack against Luffy was 16 holy bullets. Also, Emu can be read as 1-6 or 16, so that's something too, I think. But this event is probably a lot like what Doflamingo did to King Riku to take back his land, quote unquote, since his family used to control it before the Void Century. So I think this event is very, very likely to be what gets Kuma labeled as a tyrant. He probably heads out and fights the government to protect everyone, so then the government is able to spin it back on him and pin the blame on him as if he's the one who started it all. They probably end up making him out to be the aggressor, kind of like how King Riku was, even though it was Doflamingo controlling him with the strings. And I've said in several videos already that the Dressrosa flashback is kind of the hardest one for me to watch in One Piece, and now I'm gonna have to see it again probably, except with Kuma at the forefront, who already makes me feel emotional, so this just isn't gonna end well. But this does kind of answer how Sorbet got a seat at the most recent Reverie, which I think was a valid question, because I was wondering that since we know the revolutionaries liberated them, especially from a celestial dragon puppet, so there's no way they would have been given a seat at the Reverie at that point, right? But seeing that Bikori kind of made a return makes a lot of sense now. So now the thing we need to think about is how Connie became accepted as the queen, because even though it was Bonnie actually, the guards and everyone still accepted her as Queen of Sorbet as if she was a real person. So somehow this altercation isn't going to end up with it simply being Bikori or Kuma as the leader or anything. And I'm actually pretty sure that this old lady with Bonnie in this panel is the real Connie, or at least Oda wants us to make a connection, I think. And since we saw Bonnie go by Dowager Connie at the Reverie, meaning that she's widowed, I wonder if this whole situation will somehow pan out where Connie basically acts like a widowed wife of Bikori or something. I mean, how else would they have a seat at the Reverie? Like, I really can't think of anything else. So I think what's going to happen next chapter is we're going to see the continuation of the situation at Sorbet, and then maybe how it even ties to Saturn and Vegapunk. I mean, maybe Saturn himself is here at Sorbet, which is what made it familiar according to the narrator box. I mean, this whole thing could be what led Kuma to Vegapunk and becoming a robot. So I think either at the end of chapter 1099 or maybe early in 1100, we'll probably see most of the flashback that we need to see at this point, which is mainly getting to the Vegapunk stuff, because then Oda can use that as a segue to get back to the real action at Egghead, because Kuma himself is probably going to arrive soon, as is Dragon, I think, and Hope, because it would be real nice to see him do something. Apparently his commander was locked up for a couple years and they didn't seem to do anything, which sure, Oda might give us a good reason for that, but you know Luffy would never do that. Robin got taken by the government and he was ready to take on the entire government to get her back. So I'm interested to see how Oda brings Dragon into this and kind of excuses his inaction thus far. I mean, stopping Saturn and helping the crew and Bonnie and maybe Kuma, even though I kind of doubt it at this point, escape would be a great start, especially after the 1000 chapter anniversary of his introduction, and the 1000 chapter anniversary of him doing anything to help anyone pretty much in the story whenever he stops Smoker. But we'll see what happens. That's it for this video, guys. Please make sure to drop a like and hit subscribe if you haven't already, but until next time, later.